She was a devoted wife and mother whose days revolved around family, faith, and caring for others. Yet beneath the surface, her life carried mounting stress. A chronic illness had stripped away her independence. Her home was tense with conflict, and on the eve of her disappearance, she broke down in tears, whispering to her closest friend that something was terribly wrong, and begging her to watch over her children. The next afternoon, her routine unraveled. Her coat was gone, but her bag, phone, and vital medication were left behind. The house alarm tripped, and she vanished without a trace. Despite searches, tips, and years of unanswered questions, only a fragment of her remains was ever found, leaving the mystery of what happened to her hidden in silence and suspicion. Welcome to Without a Trace. I'm your host, Jalyn. Every file holds a mystery. Every story deserves to be heard. This is Pat's story. On August 18, 1958, Lucille and John Marie welcomed their baby girl, Patricia Marie, into the world. Pat's life was marked by the challenges she faced due to epilepsy, a neurological disorder she was diagnosed with at the age of 12. This condition required a strict regimen of medication, which she carried with her wherever she went. In her late 20s, Pat married Jim Viola at St. Joseph's Church. Pat and Jim went on to have 2 children together, a daughter named Christine and a son named Michael. The St. Joseph's Church continued to play a big role in the family's life. It was where the couple married in 1986 and where their children were baptized. Michael, who was 10 when his mother disappeared, was an altar server there. Christine, just 13 at the time, was active in the church's youth group, and Jim was a longtime usher. The Viola family settled into a quiet town just outside of New York City in the small town of Bogota, New Jersey. It was here that Pat loved entertaining and enjoyed having friends over for pool parties, barbecues, dancing, and singing. She was known for going above and beyond to make special occasions even more special. She made elaborate homemade cakes, perfectly personalized presents for every holiday, and made efforts to make every Christmas, birthday, and other notable days memorable. Pat was a volunteer librarian at her son's school in her free time. Family and friends remembered her generosity and her love for taking care of her extended family. Pat spent a lot of time in the last months of her life caring for her sick mother-in-law and cleaning up after her sister-in-law, Donna, who was staying in the Viola household after a difficult breakup. As much as people praised Pat's enthusiasm for her taking care of others, there was undeniably a considerable amount of stress on her. Roughly 3 months before her disappearance in November of 2000, Pat experienced a grand mal seizure. Following this, her license was suspended for 90 days at the recommendation of her doctor. This hugely limited Pat's independence and mobility. She could no longer easily do things she loved, like going to the mall alone to buy presents for her family, which she expressed sadness about during the Christmas season. Additionally, it made errands that weren't optional, for instance, traveling across town to check on her mother-in-law at the hospital, even more difficult, stressful, and time-consuming. Her driver's license had gotten suspended for 3 months, meaning she would get it back in February 2001, the present month, as long as her doctor signed off that she was fit and able. Much to Pat's distress, the doctor hadn't signed off. On February 6th, the week before her disappearance, the doctor had recommended another 3 months of suspension. As mentioned, Pat's sister-in-law Donna had been staying with the Viola family following a breakup. Donna was a smoker, but Pat was not, and she did not approve of Donna smoking in the house. The typically level-headed and non-confrontational Pat had been managing the effects of Donna's indoor smoking instead by cleaning, vacuuming, and airing out Donna's room on a daily basis. On February 12th, the day before she went missing, Pat discovered that Donna burned a hole in the guest bedspread, something that could have started a fire and put the whole family in danger. Although Pat was upset, she and her husband Jim decided to wait to address it with Donna until the following day. Later that day, on the night before her disappearance, Pat and Jim attended a party in Brooklyn at the home of Pat's best friend, Toinette. The two were more like sisters, so when Jim and Pat first arrived, Toinette could immediately sense something was off. A few minutes after arriving, Pat actually pulled her aside and said, "We need to talk right now." Heading into another room, Pat immediately fell apart, and in between sobs, she told Toinette that something was wrong, very, very wrong. Despite Toinette repeatedly asking what was wrong, Pat kept insisting that it was too complicated to discuss at the party. However, she promised to tell her everything if they could get away for a few days. Pat even asked Toinette to cancel an upcoming trip. That's how desperately she needed her best friend. What Pat said next, however, was even more concerning. She told Toinette that she wanted her to look after her kids, no matter what. Tears began to flow again, but when Toinette asked what was going on, Pat only repeated that she can't say anything yet. Seeing that she wasn't going to get any answers from her friend that night, Toinette decided to let it go. However, as soon as the party ended, she canceled her trip as promised. At 4:30 p.m. on February 13, 2001, Jim arrived home from work. He walked through the door expecting another normal evening with his family. He wouldn't usually have been home this early, but with it being Valentine's Day the next day, he left work early in order to pick up presents for Pat before heading home. Balancing his briefcase and the wrapped presents in one hand, he opened the door with the other. He expected to hear the usual calling of "hello" from Pat, but not only did she not call out, but Jim felt something uneasy in the area. The house alarm was beeping, which meant it had been activated. This surprised Jim, as Pat was always at home at this time of day. Although some people set their alarms while they were in the house, the Violas didn't. They only set their alarm when they left the house and at night when they went to sleep. For Pat to be out at this time of day was unusual for her. Pat, like the rest of the family, had very set schedules, and Pat's routine for their entire marriage always included being home when Jim got home from work. Yes, on this day, Jim was earlier than usual, but not that much earlier. Despite it being unusual, Jim tried not to jump to any worst-case scenarios just yet. After entering the code to disarm the alarm, he turned back around and noticed something out of place. The key that permanently lived in the keyhole of their back door was now laying on the kitchen table. Jim went out into the hallway to check if Pat's coat and handbag were in their usual place. Her coat was gone, but her bag, still containing her ID, phone, keys, and medication, were still there. Upon finding Pat's medication, Jim began to jump to worst-case scenarios because she needed to take her medications around 5 p.m., which was pretty much the current time that he had discovered them. He tried to convince himself that she most likely had taken some cash out of her wallet and headed off on foot to a nearby shop. However, as the hours ticked by, Jim could no longer make excuses. He began calling around to various friends and family members, but call after call brought him no closer to finding his wife. Jim then drove the different routes Pat might have taken if she was running errands, but with a pit in his stomach, he returned home still clueless. Jim knew in his gut that something was wrong. Pat wouldn't just leave without telling a soul. His panic was now in full force as Jim called the police at 11:58 p.m. to report his wife missing. 2 police officers were dispatched immediately, and an official missing persons report was filed that evening. Ordinarily, the protocol would have been for Jim to wait 24 to 48 hours before a formal report could be made. However, Pat was classified as high risk due to the fact that her medication had been left behind. Since it was late into the night at this point, there was very little that could be done. First thing the following morning, authorities began their investigation. They started by trying to build a timeline of events for the previous day. Jim explained that the morning had started out like every other morning. Everyone had been up on time, and Jim left for work at 6:30 a.m. He recalled that Pat had seemed a little more down than usual, but not enough to make him worry that something was seriously wrong. At the time, he attributed it to the fact that Pat hadn't gotten her driver's license back. Toinette called Pat that morning to discuss her emotional breakdown the night before. According to various media reports, Pat was upset, which contradicted the statements made by Jim and Pat's mom. As she had the night before, Pat refused to discuss what was going on, brushing it off, and instead she redirected the conversation to a gag gift she wanted to buy Jim for Valentine's Day. Toinette noted that Pat sounded tired and was in a hurry to get off the phone. After hanging up with Toinette, Pat suddenly stormed downstairs to confront her sister-in-law Donna about the burned bedspread. Jim would later remark that Pat's approach was extremely out of character for her. She was irate and screamed like a maniac at Donna over the incident. Christine, aged 13, and Michael, who had just turned 10, left to go to school around 8:15 a.m., followed by Pat, who left at 8:30 a.m. Investigators were able to verify the exact time she left, as that's when the home alarm was activated. From there, they were able to confirm that Pat did in fact make it safely to the school where she volunteered in the library. Police spoke to the staff at the school, but none of Pat's colleagues noticed anything off about her demeanor. Pat left the school at 11:30 a.m. as usual. Authorities were even able to track down a mailman who said he waved at her on her walk home around 11:40 a.m. Their next step was to search the family home. Police found a message on the family's answering machine from the morning of the 13th from Pat's mom. Her mom said in the message that the Viola security company called her asking if everything was okay at Jim and Pat's house because their alarm had been tripped. They tried to call Jim at work, but he hadn't been able to take the call, and even though Pat had her phone with her, she always turned it off while working. So when the security company hadn't been able to reach either of them, they called the emergency contact, which in this case was Pat's mom. The security company had also contacted the police, who did in fact send an officer to the home to check for any signs of a break-in. The officer did no more than a quick walk around the outside of the home, and when the officer didn't find any broken windows or open doors, he left. The alarm trip was simply put down as an electrical fault. The investigators called Pat's mom to inquire as to whether Pat had called her back, and she told them she had. She had called her mom back at 12:30 p.m. and reassured her that everything was okay. They asked about her demeanor, and Pat's mom told them that for the entire duration of the call, her daughter sounded normal and like herself. Investigators thought that maybe someone had forced Pat to call her mom in order to reassure her, but if so, the tone of Pat's voice certainly hadn't indicated anything of the sort. The last thing police were able to confirm was that Pat had reset the alarm at 1:11 p.m. Next, investigators spoke to the Viola's neighbors. However, none of them reported seeing nor hearing anything suspicious. There are media reports that say police even stopped buses and contacted taxi companies to see if anyone had picked Pat up from the house. In their minds, she must have left willingly because they'd found nothing to suggest otherwise. They even contacted nearby airports to see if she had flown somewhere that day. Frustratingly, for both the family and the detectives, none of these phone calls gave them any leads. Law enforcement kept in touch with the area hospitals as well, but no Jane Does or Patricia Violas were checked in. The pressure to find out what happened to Pat was beginning to mount. The number of doses she'd missed of her epilepsy medication meant the risk of having a seizure was increasing by the second. Ramping up their search efforts, police brought in cadaver dogs in an attempt to track Pat's scent. Sadly, the dogs weren't able to pick up anything. They conducted an aerial search over local rivers, but still, nothing was discovered. Pat had seemingly disappeared into thin air. Although police initially believed Pat left on her own accord, the fact that days were passing without her taking her medication shifted their thinking. They began to consider the possibility that she had been met with foul play. This new theory meant that they had to start looking for someone who might have been responsible for Pat's disappearance. And, as is often the case, that meant they needed to consider someone close to Pat. Jim had been cooperating with police since the moment he reported Pat missing, but, as is typical, the spouse is the first potential suspect. After a few grueling hours of interrogation and a lie detector test, police were confident that Jim had nothing to do with his wife's disappearance. They also corroborated the fact that he indeed had been at the mall at the estimated time of Pat's disappearance, ruling him out as a suspect. It had now been 2 weeks since Pat vanished, and the likelihood of finding her alive and unharmed was growing slimmer by the day. Jim and Toinette began their own search, with Toinette speaking to every drugstore and gift shop located within walking distance from the Viola home. The gag gift Pat mentioned wanting to buy Jim was in stock at a Rite Aid pharmacy nearby. Toinette showed the clerk a picture, and he recalled seeing Pat in the store that day, but had no idea where she went after leaving the store. Jim focused his search efforts on local hospitals. His theory was that Pat may have had another seizure, of which amnesia is a possible side effect. The police, however, disagreed with Jim's theory and explained that when a patient presents at a hospital without identification and no recollection of who they are, law enforcement is always notified to help identify the individual. If Pat had been in such a situation, they would have been informed. Despite what the police told him, he took Pat's photo to every nearby hospital to make sure she wasn't there. However, just as the police had suspected, none of the hospitals had a Jane Doe matching Pat's description. February soon turned into March, and the police were no closer to finding Pat. Jim had sent her story to every local newspaper, hoping that someone would come forward with information that could help. The tips that did come in were far and few between. But 1 month after her disappearance, one tip offered a glimmer of hope. A man had called the police, convinced that he had seen someone matching Pat's description in Pennsylvania, just 10 minutes away from where the couple had recently purchased timeshare property. The couple hadn't yet visited the property, so the police didn't initially include the timeshare property in their search. However, after receiving that tip, law enforcement quickly sprang into action. Jim accompanied authorities to check the timeshare, convinced this theory could make sense. After the argument with Donna, maybe Pat wanted to get away for a few days. Sadly, upon arrival, there was no sign of Pat and the house was untouched. Over a year would go by before another tip would come in, and this time it was unlike any other tip they received. A male caller claimed that it was him that had killed Pat. His exact words were, quote, "I killed the old girl." Police attempted to keep the caller on the line and talking for as long as possible to trace his location. However, as the conversation progressed, they realized the caller had nothing to do with Pat's disappearance. He claimed to have Pat's driver's license, but authorities knew Pat didn't have a physical license at the time due to her suspension. Despite this, since it had been a year since investigators had anything solid to go on, they continued speaking with him. The man seemed eager to keep talking and mentioned that he was currently on a bus traveling along the East Coast from Florida to Massachusetts with a woman. Although police were skeptical that the caller was connected to Pat's case, they decided to follow up. They dispatched a unit to North Carolina to stop the bus. When they did, they didn't find the caller, but they did find the woman he claimed to be traveling with. It turned out the caller was the woman's ex, who was upset that she had left him for another man. The entire situation had been a hoax. After this tip, the case officially went cold. Although the police continued to follow up on every tip they received, tips were hardly coming in. Jim did everything he could to keep Pat's name in the public eye, including working with a private investigator who had volunteered his services after seeing the website Jim had set up to provide information on Pat's case. The private investigator began his search and almost immediately came across an intriguing theory. Although the Violas lived in a relatively safe neighborhood, just a few years before Pat went missing, there had been another tragedy on their exact street. The story came from the mailman who, at the time of Pat's disappearance, had told the police that he remembered waving to Pat on her way home from work. While they were chatting, the mailman told the private investigator that it was really hard for him to believe that two crimes had happened across the street from each other in such a quiet town. The private investigator, shocked, asked what crime had occurred across the street. On October 23, 1997, a triple homicide occurred in the house opposite of the Violas. A diamond dealer was killed in a targeted robbery homicide, and the other two men in the house at the time were also killed as collateral damage. 4 men were arrested for the triple murder, and theories in the town suggested that since the trial for this crime was ongoing during Pat's disappearance, the suspects might have hired someone to kidnap or kill her, believing her to be a witness. It was later confirmed that Pat had no ties to the crime and was not on any witness lists. However, people still believed it could have been a case of mistaken identity or a killer for hire mistakenly targeting the wrong address. Despite raising hope in Pat's family, this lead ultimately went nowhere. As the years have passed, the case has remained stone cold, but Pat's family has never given up hope of finding her. Jim became an influential figure in legislation regarding missing persons. In 2008, he collaborated with government officials in New Jersey to pass Patricia's Law. This law mandates that police must accept every missing persons report regardless of the circumstances, inform the family of available support services, and, if the missing person is not found within 30 days, collect DNA samples and enter them into the national database. In 2012, the family found an answer to at least one of their questions, and it was closer than they realized. On July 27, 2002, a bone fragment from the left foot had been discovered by a man walking on a beach in Queens, New York. This fragment was found alongside a sock and a white shoe. Although the remains were found in 2002, DNA extraction wouldn't occur for another 3 years as the medical examiner's office was overwhelmed by the aftermath of 9/11. By 2012, they still had over 21,000 unidentified remains. Once the DNA from the bone fragment had been extracted, it had been sent to the University of North Texas for analysis. The remains had not been positively identified as there was no DNA match in the national database. It wasn't until 2011, when Pat's children had submitted a DNA sample to the national database, that the remains were identified as Pat's. Jim broke the news to his daughter, Christine, but Michael, who was now 21, was in a medically induced coma due to an infection. It wasn't until he was out of the hospital that the family was finally able to hold a memorial service for Pat. Unfortunately, investigators have been unable to draw any conclusions about what happened to Pat. The beach where her foot was found stretches about 5.5 miles and leads directly into the Atlantic Ocean, making it impossible to determine where or how her body could have entered the water. At the time of the discovery, police conducted thorough searches of the beach, both on land and with helicopters, but no additional remains were found. Police maintain that Pat's case is still very much open. They haven't ruled out anything, and they continue to work to bring closure to the Viola family. Thank you for listening to Without a Trace. I hope you enjoyed our deep dive into Pat's disappearance. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and follow Without a Trace on social media, and join me next week as I dive into another case.